SELC is dedicated to the climate problem because it's a core that impacts everything that we do. From protecting our forests, our wetlands, the creatures that we love, the community and the people here in the South. I'm Alys Campaigne, and I'm the Climate Initiative Leader here at the Southern Environmental Law Center. Living in Charleston, South Carolina gives me a real front row seat onto what's happening with climate change. Increases in flooding make it sometimes impossible to even get to my office downtown. That's happening more often. The South is on the front lines of the climate emergency. We have a huge coastal population that is facing real risk from rising seas and from flooding, but it's not just a coastal problem.
With climate change, we have a really wide range of extremes that we're dealing with. And so across our 6 states, they each have a different flavor. Here in the low country of South Carolina, we have the problem of too much water. We are thinking about things like how to manage flooding, what happens to the drinking water when sea levels rise and potentially intrude, how do we keep water from being polluted. While other parts of our region, we have a lack of water and wildfire risk, changes in crop patterns, heat problems that are coming into cities that don't have enough tree canopy. So the climate emergency calls on us to be really specific about how we protect and involve communities in solutions that work for the challenges facing them.
There's a tremendous amount of climate momentum coming out of Washington. It is largely in the form of 2 big pieces of legislation. One was the bipartisan infrastructure law, but the real turning point was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which authorized roughly $1 trillion in spending to combat the climate emergency.
To me, one of the most exciting elements of all of this climate spending is that we're rethinking how infrastructure and planning and federal resources are deployed across our country and in our region specifically. Historically, federal agencies have given money to state officials and they decide kind of what's best. And so there's a new approach, especially using a Justice 40 lens, which is saying that communities that have borne the disproportionate burden of environmental injustices and pollution should be put to the front of the line when those investments hit the ground here in the States. And so in order to make that happen, there is a lot of money to help communities begin to first talk about and identify the biggest sources of pollution problems and to see where they feel vulnerable in the face of a changing climate. And those dollars are already being used in Bucksport, in Rosemont, in Union Heights, in areas outside of Savannah. The community involvement is growing and enabling people to have a voice and direct specifically where those investments should come first and be most effective, rather than it coming from somebody who's looking at it on a piece of paper but doesn't have the lived experience of what it's like to be in that neighborhood when a flood or a storm comes in.
Inflation Reduction Act investments are a tremendous lever to propel the South forward and to deliver on meaningful climate solutions. That funding is coming to our states and communities in a variety of ways, in forms of tax incentives, of direct grants, of loans. And in South Carolina, one of the examples of what that looks like is money for communities that are seeing repeated flooding in areas that have sources of pollution that they're really concerned about. Rosemont is an area that has borne a tremendous burden of pollution over the years. It's a historically Black community. It's an area that was connected to a thriving naval base and industry that has long since been left behind, and is now really trying to hold on to their neighborhood fabric and rebuild and use these federal funds to create a, once again, more vibrant place to live. And it is working with some of its adjoining neighbor partners to use federal planning money to look for the hot spots of where air pollution concerns are coming from, where the flooding is coming from, and to find ways to address them. So rain gardens, planting things that can absorb the water, looking for places where you can get rid of some of the pavement so that water can filtrate into the soil. Sometimes solutions are pretty simple.
Rain gardens and other green building techniques can be a really important complement to keeping our wetlands healthy and to amplifying their most effective functions. The wetlands are nature's best and first defense from rising seas and storms, and over the nearly 2 decades that I've lived here, it has been fascinating to watch as hurricanes or big fronts move through how much water a functioning wetland can store. I mean, they're built to do this on every tide cycle, and people that live near them are counting on those wetlands to protect their homes as the sea levels rise. Some of the alternatives of seawalls and riprap and things like that, they might work in a specific application, but they tend to leave people out. Someone's not behind that wall, and that means the water is still flowing, it's still moving somewhere, and it's just displaced into another community. And so the nature-based solutions feel both inclusive and more resilient in the face of the unknowns as the climate changes. Right behind us, you can see nature-based solutions at work. These are small, mostly oyster shell island hammocks that are helping to protect against flooding and create nesting habitat for the shorebirds. Restoration efforts are underway to add oyster bed systems where marsh grasses then fill in behind it. We also have some Spartina grass replanting projects that are underway to restore marsh health. In contrast, right across the busy Charleston Harbor, you see the peninsula of Charleston, where there is a very expensive seawall that's being proposed that is essentially just building a wall to protect residents inside. And so we are engaged in trying to make sure that that seawall incorporates more nature-based solutions and to make sure that we're not leaving communities out or displacing water into communities that will then be facing additional flooding from the hardening structures. The federal government doesn't know what is best in South Carolina, in Tennessee, Alabama, in Georgia, North Carolina. Our long-standing commitment to our 6 states, our knowledge of the people, the communities, the places, the decision makers puts us at a real advantage. And so we are very well equipped to identify where the opportunities are, but we can also see when things might have the potential to go astray.
We have nearly 4 decades of ideas and experience in all of the sectors that are being affected, whether that's putting in transit systems, road projects, drinking water, wastewater, housing, building efficiency. Our mapping skills, our geospatial skills are also very important for making sure that we're not going to spend federal money on projects in areas that are right in harm's way, that are about to be flooded. We want to make sure those dollars are put on high ground. We want to use our understanding of the landscape to make sure that we're building solutions in places that can endure for the long haul.
Right now, we are in North Charleston at a park on Philbin Creek. This happens to be the most polluted area in terms of the creek systems that are tested by our partner group, Charleston Waterkeeper. It tests high for bacterial levels and also for other industrial contaminants because, as you can see, we are in a very heavily industrialized area. We have a port, we have a paper mill, we have coal terminals, we have a number of chemical facilities. And in addition, we have tremendous development pressure that's been happening in and along this corridor. So Philbin Creek used to be a functioning creek system, and the natural creek system would help protect and filter pollutants. But since the industrialization has occurred, there have been floodgates put in, there are berms that are built, and it has turned this into really kind of a drainage pool that has become a concentration point for contaminants. At the most basic level, we urgently need the federal funding to update the maps and risk assessments so that we can identify areas that are in low-lying geographies and where there is a concentration of potential industrial or chemical contamination.
The climate challenge is also a real opportunity. It's an opportunity to reimagine how we live, how we connect with one another, how we get around. I am hopeful that we can take this transformational federal investment and translate it into the kinds of projects that will reduce the pollution that's coming out of our smokestacks and our tailpipes. I'm excited that it's going to be able to help us plan for and move out of harm's way to clean up some of the aging infrastructure that is very vulnerable in the face of new storms and sea level rise, and to deliver on the promise of making the South part of the climate solution. This is an opportunity to be creative and to flourish.